I'm going to respond to an Ask Pastor John podcast where he's asked the question, does God control all things all the time? We've gone over Piper's teaching on meticulous divine determinism, sometimes referred to as compatibilism. It is just plain old theistic determinism. It's what it is. Now, they like to paint it in different ways sometimes and try to put a spin to it to make it sound better than it really is, but that's really all it is. It's God is the decider of all decisions. He is the determiner of all determinations. He is the chooser of all choices. That's it in a nutshell. There's not really much else to say about it except it's divine meticulous determinism. How it does not lead to fatalism, even by John Piper's own admission, I really can't say. There's not a clear indication of how it doesn't lead to fatalism. It's just that they say it doesn't. And you're supposed to take their word for it. So I push back on Piper because he's probably the most influential Calvinist in America today, especially among Southern Baptists, my denomination. And so I just think people need to call him out when he's wrong. I can do so in love. There's nothing divisive about saying, I love you, but you're wrong on this point. And I think he's just wrong on this particular point. I think he's taking a more Gnostic approach, not a biblical approach to a difficult philosophical issue of God's omniscience and his omnipotence and applying it onto the scriptures. And I don't think he's applying them rightly. I think the interpretations of the text that are in question are very questionable and the way he approaches them. And this particular part of the answer, I'm calling him out on because he's stealing from the non-Calvinist. He's stealing from the provisionalist like myself and the Arminians. He's stealing from those who affirm the freedom of the will by using the word permission. Now, I've gone over this a little bit in other broadcasts, but oftentimes you'll hear Calvinists refer to God allowing something to happen or permitting something to happen. And I'm just asking the question, if there is not something outside of God's will to permit, then what are you permitting? Your own will? So is God permitting his own determination? That makes no sense whatsoever. When you say you're permitting something, it is implying, if not explicitly connoting, the fact that there's something outside of yourself to permit and or restrain. You'll hear people talk, he permits this or he restrains that. What's he permitting and or restraining if not the autonomous will of a creature? There's nothing to permit if there's not free will. Ladies and gentlemen, there's not. And I'm not the one who originally argued that. In fact, John Calvin's not the one who originally argued it, but John Calvin is the one we're going to look at because he debunks, calls it childish, and calls it a vain refuge to appeal to permission we're going to look at. But before we do that, let's listen to John Piper's answer to the question. I'm going to pick up in the middle of it. I'll put the link in the show notes for you to listen to his whole answer. He gives some biblical proof text for why he believes in meticulous divine determinism of all things. But we're just going to call him out on when he uses the word permission because he's stealing from our vocabulary. And I'm just going to call him out on it. Piper, you can't do that. You can't say God permits something because you believe he actually meticulously causes, controls, does all things, as we've played you saying time and time again.
I'm not in control here. It's arrogant, he says, to think you're in control. God is in control. Lastly, God's permission for Satan or man to act is nevertheless part of God's ultimate design and final control. So I'm trying to respond here to someone who says, well, God doesn't control everything. He permits lots of things. I'm saying that's right. He certainly does permit lots of things. How should we understand an all-knowing God with perfect foreknowledge permitting something in his infinite wisdom? So here's what Jesus says in Luke 22:31. Simon, Simon, as he's talking to Peter just before he denies the Lord. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, not if you have turned again, when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. In other words, yes, I'm going to give Satan permission to sift you like wheat, and I know it's going to involve 3 denials, and I know you're going to turn, and I know that the purpose of bringing you back according to my prayer is that you might strengthen your brothers. So even in situations where God is permitting, he's permitting by design. When you permit something and you know what it's going to do and you know all of its outcomes and you go ahead and permit it, you permit it wisely if you're God, and it wisely fits into the overall pattern of what you are planning and doing.
Okay. So there he's, again, using the concept of permission, but within the concept of foreknowledge and God's all-knowingness. What he's trying to argue is that God permitting it is a part of his sovereign plan. Now that's molinism. that's all that really is. When you're talking about God foreknowing things that people are going to do and then permitting those things that people do, that's basic foresight Arminianism. That's molinism explained more philosophically and deeper. He's using our argumentation to support meticulous divine determinism. But as we've played before in other broadcasts, when he talks about every desire, every dust mite, every particle, everything being meticulously controlled and determined by God, you can't use that vocabulary because he's not just knowing in advance what Peter will freely do in denying Christ. According to Piper's own other words being played before, he determined for Peter to deny Christ. He brought it to pass. Very clearly, John Piper says, God does not just merely work these evil things like rape and the Holocaust and other things. He doesn't just merely work them for good or take them and redeem them for good. It says he actually brings about those evil things, including the very intentions, the very actions of man. So Peter, when he was tempted to deny Christ, the temptation was causally determined by God. The one being tempted, and when he fell into temptation, when he denied Christ, the desire to deny Christ, that was meticulously determined by God, not just merely permitted. In other words, God brought it about for his greatest glory, according to, again, Piper's own words. And so now it's almost like when he's getting pressed on the question, isn't God permitting these things? He's going, yeah, well, God permits them. He does permit these things, but because he foreknows what will happen, his permitting is actually a part of his sovereign design. Okay, well, again, that's molinism. Okay, that's what simple foresight faith kind of guys say. He permits things that he foreknows is going to happen, and he doesn't restrain somebody from. That's just he's stealing from us, our vocabulary. He's giving explanations as we would give them, not as someone who holds to compatibilistic determinism. That's just the simple truth of the matter. And the reason we know this is not just because of what John Piper teaches, but what Calvinism proper actually believes and teaches with regard to these things. And I think we can see this more clearly when we just look at Calvin's own words. This is, again, quote from John Calvin: "How foolish and frail is the support of divine justice afforded by the suggestion that evil comes to be not by his will, but by his permission." So notice what he's saying here. He's calling, so John Piper is being called out by John Calvin. So if I'm kind of resurrecting Calvin from the grave here, and John Calvin is now calling John Piper foolish and frail. Okay? So it's not me calling John Piper foolish and frail. John Calvin thinks he's foolish and frail because he's using Arminian vocabulary. He's giving a molinistic explanation to how foreknowledge and divine foreknowledge and permission works. Okay, he's using their words and their vocabulary, and John Calvin is calling John Piper foolish and frail. Is the support of divine justice afforded by the suggestion that evil comes to be not by his will, but by his permission? See what he's saying? He's getting on to people like Piper saying, this is not by his permission, it's by his will. It's not, he doesn't permit this, he wills it. Okay, it's quite frivolous refuge, he says, to say that God obtusely permits them when Scripture shows him not only willing, but the author of them. Now, this was before the Westminster Confession was written, where they said that God is not the author of evil. But oops, Calvin didn't get that memo yet. He didn't know the word author was off the table. The word determiner is still there, apparently, or you can say he's the cause or the bringer abouter or the doer of evil. All those words are the ones Calvinists use that we've played here before, explaining what God does with regard to evil. But for some reason, author is off the list. And so Calvin hadn't got the memo yet, apparently, for the Calvinists. And so he uses the word author here. So he's he's the author of them referring back to the evils that come about. So he's the author of evil, according to, again, this quoting from John Calvin, and it's the source here, Eternal Predestination of God. You can go see it for yourself. I'm not trying to misrepresent him. I always encourage you to go read the sources, go look them up. And read them for yourself, because we're confronting, again, a Gnostic doctrine that has been resurrected and is growing among our generations today. And we need to confront it, I think, because I think it's a dangerous doctrine. But again, let's look again at Calvin's rebuke of what you heard Piper just explain. Here's another quote from John Calvin discussing the distinction that has been invented between doing and permitting. So notice what he's doing here. John Calvin is teaching the difference between doing and permitting. And I've played other episodes. Go back and listen to them. I've played other episodes where Piper actually says God is doing it. God knows the future because he performs the future, Piper said in that other broadcast, remember? So in other places, they're not always real consistent. There's times in which you get them on a track and they'll come right out and say what they think. And then you get somebody cornering them and asking them questions. Well, doesn't God permit things? Doesn't God just allow? And then they don't want to be, put into a corner of being a total fatalist and stuff. So they'll say things, well, yeah, God permitted it. But what's he permitting? What is he permitting? Himself? It just does not make any sense, which is exactly what John Calvin is saying, that you're trying to invent a distinction between doing and permitting. And here's what he says. From other passages in which God is said to draw or bend Satan himself and all the reprobate. And the reason I read this one is because in the analogy that he gives about permitting Satan to sift him, he kind of talks as if Satan's acting by himself because he's permitting him, versus Satan being controlled, in other words, being determined, being a puppet in a sense of God. God's the one who wields Satan to do what he wants him to do and controls ultimately his will under the deterministic worldview. So from other passages in which God is said to draw or bend Satan himself and all the reprobate to his will, a more difficult question arises. For the carnal mind can scarcely comprehend how, when acting by their means, he contracts no taint from their impurity. In other words, it's kind of hard to understand these words because they're spoken in that Old English kind of language, but he's ultimately saying how God isn't guilty for causing Satan to do what Satan does, or evil creatures to do what that they do, is beyond his comprehension. He doesn't know how it works. He doesn't know how he's not tainted by their impurity. Nay, how in a common operation is he exempt from all guilt and can justly condemn his own ministers? In other words, I don't know how God condemns his own ministers of evil, because he's ultimately what he's calling these Satan and the evil creature, minister of God. In other words, I guess you're an evil minister of God. Whatever. So hence, a distinction has been invented. Listen, this is again, Calvin is talking and he's rebuking what Piper just said ultimately by using the word permission, okay? A distinction has been invented between doing and permitting, because to many it seemed altogether inexplicable how Satan and all the wicked are so under the hand and authority of God that he directs their malice to do whatever he pleases and employs their iniquities to execute his judgments. You see what he's doing? He's going, okay, you weak, childlike, carnal-minded people who are using the word permission out there, you're trying to invent something between the concept of God doing it softening it by saying, well, he's just permitting it. And Calvin's coming down on them for that. That's what he's doing here, okay? On the screen, that's what he's saying. He's saying, Satan, all the wicked, when Peter denied Christ, God was doing it, okay? That's what, he's not permitting Peter to do it, to deny Christ. He's doing it. There's no distinction between doing and permitting in Calvin's mind. Why? Because he's a determinist, okay? That's consistent determinism. Please hear this. The modesty of those who are thus alarmed at the appearance of absurdity might perhaps be excused, did they not endeavor to vindicate the justice of God from every semblance of stigma by defending an untruth. It seems absurd that a man should be blinded by the will and command of God, and yet forthwith punished for his blindness. Hence recourse is had to the evasion that this is done only by permission, and not also by the will of God. So notice what he's saying here. He's saying when people say this is done, just God just permitting it versus his willing it, that they're just evading the truth of the matter. He himself, however, openly declaring that he does this repudiates the evasion. Men do nothing save at the secret instigation of God. So notice that. Men do nothing save at the secret instigation of God. So God instigates all evil intentions and actions. That's what he is saying. That's determinism. That is Calvinism. This is John Calvin. Okay? Do not accuse me of misrepresenting Calvinism when I'm reading from the sources and playing the sources for themselves. Maybe it's you that doesn't understand Calvinism, brethren. Again, I say this with respect and love, but the number one response I get is for people saying, you don't understand Calvinism. Who's reading the sources? Who's presenting the actual words of John Calvin himself from books that are on the subject? Again, you don't have to agree with everything that John Piper and John Calvin say with regard to Calvinism in order to be considered a Calvinist, but these guys are the most notable Calvinist out there. At least you can stop accusing me of not understanding Calvinism, and you can say, well, wait, no, we don't agree with that form of Calvinism. That would be a more appropriate response to me than saying, hey, you don't understand Calvinism. No, maybe I actually do understand Calvinism and you don't. And you've adopted a lower form, a more inconsistent form of the systematic that's just about the predestination of those who will be saved. And you don't even want to get into all this other stuff of him predetermining the evil of child rape and Holocaust and all that stuff. And maybe you just don't want to touch that and you just don't want to deal with the implications of all of that. Great. But don't call yourself a Calvinist and then accuse us of not understanding it. Okay? Again, I say so in respect, but it gets tiresome when you're trying to confront a systematic that's growing within your denomination and among young people around you, and people keep coming up, oh, you just don't understand Calvinism. You just don't. Maybe you don't understand the system that you're promoting. You don't understand the implications of it fully. Maybe that's the problem. I'm just saying.